In the late 19th century, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a small group of men cut themselves off from the outside world. They believed isolation would preserve their strength, their faith, and their bloodline. What began as a strict code of purity soon spiraled into something far darker. For 7 generations, brothers married cousins, uncles wed nephews, and sons were bound to the laws of their elders. In time, the valley became a prison of flesh and blood, where deformities and suffering replaced the promise of salvation. When investigators finally broke through the isolation, what they found was almost unimaginable. Men whose very existence carried the scars of centuries of confinement, men who had never seen a city, a car, or even electricity. This is not just a story of secrecy and control. It is a story of how an entire line of men was reshaped by one decision made in a forgotten valley more than 100 years earlier. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with a friend. Together, we'll uncover the hidden truths history tried to bury. The story begins in the late 19th century, when Joseph Jackson, a determined patriarch, led a band of men deep into the Appalachian Mountains. Their mission was singular: escape society and create a brotherhood untouched by outsiders. These men carried little more than tools, a few livestock, and their faith. Joseph demanded discipline above all else. He forbade all contact with strangers, insisting that his sons and nephews must only unite with their own kin. The valley chosen was naturally fortified, steep ridges, dense forests, and rivers cutting off easy passage. To Joseph, this geography was divine proof they were chosen. To his brothers, it was both sanctuary and prison. Joseph's decree was absolute. No man would leave, no man would marry beyond their circle. Sons would take cousins as husbands, uncles would wed nephews, and the bloodline would remain closed. To disobey meant exile. At first, the group numbered barely 24 men. They built log homes with their own hands, raised crops, and hunted the surrounding forest. Discipline gave structure, but secrecy gave power. Joseph's word carried the force of Scripture. The early years were difficult. Harsh winters tested their strength, yet the men endured. They believed their unity made them stronger than outsiders. But beneath this resolve, seeds of weakness were already sown into their lineage. The second decade in the valley saw Joseph Jackson's laws deepen. Brothers married brothers, cousins took each other as husbands, and uncles bound themselves to nephews. Each union was celebrated as proof of loyalty to Joseph's vision. Men began to forget what outsiders even looked like. Sons grew under the constant reminder that leaving the valley meant eternal betrayal. Fathers told them, "Our blood is sacred, and it must never be diluted." As the community expanded, every settlement decision was controlled by Joseph and his council of elders. These older men judged disputes, arranged unions, and reminded younger brothers that strength came only through obedience to the patriarch's code. Daily life revolved around survival. Men split logs, hunted deer, and built crude barns. Sons carried water from streams, while uncles taught nephews to trap animals. Their world shrank to mountains, sky, and the watchful eyes of elders. The men of the valley rarely questioned why their world was so limited. Without books, without teachers, they relied entirely on their fathers' words. Stories told around fires glorified isolation and painted outsiders as diseased, corrupt, and dangerous. Yet even in these early years, small cracks appeared. A few sons were born frail, unable to walk properly. Some brothers whispered uneasily, but dared not speak aloud. Joseph's decree remained unbreakable, and dissent was swallowed by silence. By the third decade, sons of sons grew into men themselves, yet no new blood entered the community. Marriages repeated within narrower circles. Cousins who were also nephews wed, and uncles fathered sons with their own kin. Joseph watched these unions with satisfaction. To him, the valley was a fortress of strength. To others, it was becoming a cage. But still, men obeyed. Generations were raised knowing nothing outside their patriarch's command. A culture of secrecy deepened. The elders recorded births and unions inside a worn Bible, marking names but rarely explaining lineages. Sons were often unsure who their fathers truly were, though all knew Joseph as the source. Around fires at night, songs and prayers echoed through the valley. Men told stories of Joseph's greatness, how he had led them from a corrupted world. For young sons, these tales became unquestioned truth. Still, whispers persisted. Some brothers wondered why their sons grew weaker, why nephews struggled with speech, why cousins showed twisted fingers. But every question met the same answer. The outside world is worse. Stay pure. Thus, the foundation of the Jackson Valley was set. A closed brotherhood of men bound by law, faith, and fear. What began as conviction in one man's vision soon evolved into an inheritance of isolation and inevitability. By the early 1900s, the second generation of Jackson men was born. These were the sons of brothers, the nephews of uncles, the cousins bound by Joseph's decree to remain only within the valley. At first, life seemed stable. The men hunted, built stronger cabins, and worked the fields together. Sons looked to fathers and uncles as models of endurance, believing isolation had blessed them with strength outsiders could never know. But cracks in the bloodline became harder to ignore. Some boys were born small and fragile, struggling to walk or breathe. Others had hands with extra fingers or jaws that never formed properly. Silence covered every deformity. Elders dismissed concerns with ritual phrases. They claimed such sons were tested by heaven, chosen to carry burdens for the community. Fathers nodded, even when nephews cried through nights of pain with no remedy available. Without doctors, without knowledge beyond the valley, men accepted what they saw. They convinced themselves every twisted limb or weakened heart was divine judgment, not the direct result of generations marrying only brothers and cousins. By 1910, the effects grew sharper. Some sons could not speak clearly, producing sounds that only fathers could barely understand. Uncles invented crude gestures to communicate, building a private language that deepened their separation from outsiders. Mortality struck harshly. Half the boys born in some years never reached adulthood. Graves filled quickly on the hillside cemetery, each marked by crude wooden crosses built by grieving brothers who had no words of explanation. Still, the elders clung to Joseph's commandments. They declared every son's death a necessary sacrifice to preserve purity. Any suggestion of opening the valley to outsiders was silenced, branded as betrayal of their founder's law. The strongest sons continued the cycle. Cousins wed cousins. Uncles bound themselves to nephews. Sons grew into husbands for their own kin. The web tightened, each union narrowing blood further until it felt inescapable. Among the younger men, doubts brewed quietly. Some wondered why their fathers limped, why their brothers' faces carried unusual shapes. But questioning aloud meant punishment. Loyalty to the patriarch's line was valued above all. Isolation hardened the community. Winters starved them of meat, and poor harvests left pantries bare. Yet rather than break free, men doubled down, claiming that only within the valley could their blood remain sacred. Stories of the outside world faded into myth. Sons were told of cities where men grew weak, sick, and corrupted. These tales ensured loyalty, teaching each boy that venturing beyond mountains meant certain destruction. By the late 1920s, nearly every man in the valley carried some physical mark, an extra digit, a misshapen ear, or eyes spaced unnaturally wide. Yet within their closed world, such features became normal. No one dared call them deformities. Instead, elders spoke of signs, claiming these unique traits proved divine selection. Fathers taught sons to wear their marks proudly, as proof they were unlike the corrupted bloodlines outside. Yet survival grew harder. Infant deaths rose to terrifying heights. Sometimes 3 or 4 sons in a row would die before their first winter. Fathers wept silently, digging graves in frozen ground, never speaking their doubts. The community's men believed endurance was proof of purity. Each loss was explained away as heaven's will, never genetics. They continued marrying within the same bloodlines, blind to the storm of weakness growing with each generation. Thus, the valley's fate began to twist further. What began as loyalty to Joseph's dream now revealed its price. Sons weaker than their fathers, nephews marked by afflictions, and a lineage slowly unraveling under the weight of its own rules. By the 1930s, the valley's lineage was no longer a simple chain of fathers and sons. Instead, it had become a tangled knot where cousins were brothers, uncles were husbands, and nephews were fathers simultaneously. Every man carried overlapping ties. One son might be both cousin and brother to another. An uncle could also be a father, depending on which marriage the elders had forced decades earlier. Clarity disappeared completely. The Jackson men no longer questioned these bonds. They accepted the web as natural. Their fathers had told them this was purity, and purity demanded sacrifice. To them, family lines were no longer distinct. The genealogical record, written in Joseph's ancient Bible, became incomprehensible. Names repeated endlessly: Joseph, Ezekiel, Samuel, Benjamin, appearing on multiple lines with no explanation. Sons were given names of uncles, nephews bore names of cousins. Confusion deepened the entanglement. Investigators later admitted such a web could never be mapped with precision. But in the 1930s, the men of the valley never saw it as a problem. To them, it was tradition, unbreakable and holy. Outsiders were forgotten entirely. Few sons even knew such men existed. To them, the valley was the world, and all blood outside was impure. Their universe shrank to brothers, cousins, fathers, and uncles. Daily survival carried on. Men cut wood, tilled fields, and hunted. But alongside their strength, deformities grew. Sons were born with cleft jaws, twisted limbs, or hearts too weak to beat more than a few years. Brothers buried brothers, sometimes only weeks old. Fathers dug graves beside nephews, each wooden cross standing as silent testimony to the cost of their rules. Still, the elders declared every death was heaven's chosen will. Among stronger sons, obedience remained absolute. They married whoever the elders commanded, even if it meant uniting with cousins who were also uncles or nephews who were also brothers. Each union tied the blood tighter, leaving no escape. Communication fractured further. Many sons could not speak clearly. Men invented an internal sign language of gestures and sounds, passed from fathers to sons. Outsiders would have found it incomprehensible, but within the valley, it became normal. Isolation deepened the belief that nothing beyond mountains mattered. When storms cut them off for months, men accepted it as divine design. To them, survival without outsiders was not just necessity, it was proof of righteousness. But nature gave reminders of fragility. Harsh winters claimed weak sons. Harsh summers burned crops. The men endured, but their bodies betrayed the cost of closed blood. Even strong hunters carried deformities invisible at birth, but crippling later. By mid-1930s, almost every man bore some visible difference. Eyes set too far apart, skulls oddly shaped, extra digits on hands. Some could barely walk, requiring brothers to carry them through daily tasks. Yet still, obedience continued. Fathers never admitted weakness openly. Instead, they taught sons to believe deformities marked them as chosen. They told boys, "You are stronger than outsiders. Your body shows heaven's touch, not illness." And the sons believed. But beneath the surface, despair lingered. Some younger men whispered privately about escaping the valley, yet they feared punishment, feared exile, feared dishonoring their fathers. Silence smothered rebellion, and the cycle of closed unions never broke. Each passing generation drew the net tighter. The valley's men lived in a web of blood so entangled that outsiders would later call it unimaginable. Yet to them, it was simply life, inherited from Joseph's command. By the end of the third generation, the Jackson men were bound together in ways no outsiders could comprehend. Their lineage had become both their cage and their identity, each union tightening the web until freedom seemed impossible. By the 1950s, a peculiar syndrome emerged among the Jackson men. Their skin developed a strange bluish tone, a condition caused by a rare enzyme deficiency. The Valley called it the Jackson mark. This unusual color was first seen in sons of cousins who had married uncles. The elders declared it proof of divine favor, but in truth it revealed a dangerous genetic collapse deepening across generations. Alongside the bluish hue, severe facial malformations became common. Some men had underdeveloped jaws, others wide-set eyes, and others malformed ears. These traits passed from fathers to sons, reinforcing the cycle of visible difference. Within the valley, such appearances became normalized. Brothers greeted each other without comment. Uncles raised nephews as though nothing were unusual. To them, the Jackson mark was not deformity, but identity, a badge of belonging. Elders preached that the mark proved purity. They told sons that outsiders would never understand, that only Jackson blood carried the sacred blue. For young men, this became both pride and prison. Daily life grew harder. Men with twisted jaws struggled to chew food, relying on brothers to prepare softer meals. Others with malformed ears heard poorly, forcing nephews to shout or use their growing system of hand signs. Yet even as suffering mounted, the elders refused change. They arranged unions between cousins, commanded nephews to marry uncles, and dismissed pleas for relief. They saw weakness not as warning, but as test of endurance. The fourth-generation cemetery revealed the truth more starkly. Rows of small graves, many marked by crude crosses, testified to sons who never lived past infancy. Mortality soared, but still the cycle continued without pause. Some sons survived longer, but could not speak or walk. They sat silently in cabins, cared for by brothers who labored through fields. Their presence was accepted, but their futures were sealed before birth. Communication within the valley fractured further. Entire groups of men relied solely on signs and gestures, creating a dialect outsiders would never decode. Their voices faded, their language shrank, and their world grew more insular. The Jackson mark soon became the community's defining symbol. Men carried it on their skin, their faces, their very breath. It united them, but it also chained them more tightly to their fate. When winters grew harsh, weak sons perished first. Fathers carried lifeless boys to frozen ground, burying them beside generations past. Each grave marked the hidden cost of blood purity demanded by Joseph's ancient decree. Younger men occasionally questioned why the mark appeared. They asked why brothers looked more like cousins than strangers should. But elders silenced such doubts quickly, branding questions as betrayal of sacred blood. The valley's isolation grew total. Men who had never seen a city believed their condition unique, chosen, holy. They never knew their marks were evidence of genetic entrapment, not divine destiny. By late 1950s, nearly every man bore visible traits of the mark. Some could no longer farm, others could not hunt, leaving stronger brothers to shoulder labor for all. Yet loyalty to elders endured. The Jackson mark, though crippling, became their shared identity. Sons wore it as proof of belonging, fathers taught it as blessing, uncles defended it as law. Outsiders might see deformity, but within it was heritage. Thus, the fourth generation of Jackson men was defined not by strength, but by a mark etched into their very flesh. The cycle of blood had spoken, and its signature could not be erased. By the 1970s, the Jackson lineage reached a breaking point. The fifth generation of men was born weaker than any before. Fertility plummeted, and those who survived infancy rarely lived without constant struggle. Infant mortality soared beyond half of all births. Fathers buried sons before learning their first words. Graves multiplied across the hillside, while uncles spoke of tests from heaven rather than admitting the truth of collapsing blood. Those who lived carried severe malformations. Some boys lacked the strength to stand. Others never formed words. A few had faces twisted so drastically that even their brothers struggled to recognize human likeness in them. The valley grew quieter. Cabins housed silent sons unable to speak. Brothers spent days carrying weakened nephews from place to place, feeding them carefully and hoping each winter would not claim another fragile life. The elders continued decrees. Cousins still wed cousins. Uncles still bound themselves to nephews. Despite obvious collapse, they called every marriage sacred, convinced purity would eventually return strength to the bloodline if they endured long enough. But strength did not return. Instead, each new birth revealed deeper collapse. Many sons were born with fused fingers, spines curved unnaturally, or skulls unable to close properly. Survival past childhood became rare fortune. Daily work fell on the few strong. Men without deformities hunted, farmed, and chopped wood for entire households. Exhaustion pressed heavily, but no one dared challenge the law of closed blood. Communication nearly disappeared. Many sons had no speech at all. The valley's private sign language expanded, gestures growing more elaborate, replacing voices. To outsiders it would seem alien, but to Jackson men it was normal. Cabins became divided between able and unable. Stronger men carried weaker brothers daily, washed them, clothed them, and fed them. It was care born not of choice, but of obligation imposed by shared blood. By late 1970s, fertility declined sharply. Marriages produced fewer sons. The valley echoed with silence, cabins with no children, and elders who grew fearful of extinction. Yet still they insisted outsiders must never be touched. For the first time, desperation shadowed rituals. Elders promised sons that sacrifice was proof of loyalty. They told men that surviving brothers carried divine blessings, while dead sons were honored martyrs of purity. Behind closed doors, younger men whispered doubts. Some asked if their fathers had been wrong. Some considered escape. But fear of punishment, fear of exile, and fear of betraying brothers silenced rebellion. The fifth generation marked a visible collapse. Where once a valley bustled with laboring men, now fields lay half-tilled, hunts grew scarce, and cabins filled with silence. Their world shrank under the weight of decay. Burial grounds overflowed. More graves than cabins dotted the hillside. Fathers built crude markers by hand, praying silently above them. Still, they told each other the same lie. Their blood remained chosen, their suffering holy. The mark of collapse defined them. Twisted limbs, voiceless mouths, and frail lungs became the valley's inheritance. Sons who survived adulthood were shadows of their ancestors, yet elders called them proof of divine will. By the decade's end, the valley stood at the edge of ruin. The fifth generation had nearly destroyed itself, but still obedience held. The code of Joseph Jackson chained them tighter than death itself. Thus, the collapse of the fifth generation revealed the true cost of isolation. What began as faith in one patriarch's dream now left an entire line of men broken, silent, and bound to inevitable decline. In early 1983, the valley's century of secrecy cracked. A storm swept the mountains, tearing down fences meant to keep men inside. Amid chaos, one young Jackson son found courage to escape the prison. He was only 16, yet years of silent doubts pushed him forward. He slipped through broken timber, ran through snow, and descended toward the towns below. For the first time, he saw roads. The boy's arrival shocked authorities. Dirty, frail, and barely articulate, he struggled to explain his world. But his eyes, wide with fear and strange familiarity, convinced men he carried truth no one could invent. Police organized an expedition. When they entered the valley, what they discovered stunned even hardened investigators. More than 200 Jackson men lived there, most carrying deformities, twisted bodies, or minds locked in childlike silence. Cabins lacked electricity, plumbing, or knowledge of the outside world. Many men had never seen a car, a phone, or even a book. Their universe was huts, fields, brothers, cousins, and graves. Doctors called in to examine survivors were horrified. They saw conditions previously known only from medical texts: skulls malformed, limbs fused, lungs deformed. Some sons showed entirely new mutations, never before documented in modern science. Investigators struggled even to identify individuals. Records were scribbled in a tattered Bible, names repeated endlessly, fathers indistinguishable from uncles. Many men didn't know their true lineage, only that all were sons of Jackson blood. One elder, Ezekiel Jackson, resisted outsiders fiercely. He declared, "We have lived strong through purity. Outsiders are corrupt." But his words clashed against the sight of broken brothers, silent nephews, and sons who could barely survive. The authorities found a cabin that shocked them further, an isolated shack called the House of Special Sons. Inside lay men with the severest deformities, some chained to beds, unable to feed or move themselves. Investigators realized they faced an unprecedented human case. Never before had so many generations of consanguineous unions been documented so fully. The Jackson Valley became a living, breathing record of genetic collapse. As word spread, scientists arrived quickly. Geneticists collected samples, tracing mutations across brothers and cousins. They identified dozens of rare disorders concentrated in this group, conditions that normally appeared in fewer than 1 in 100,000. Some evidence revealed the elders knew more than they admitted. Hidden papers showed discussions of which unions produced fewer monsters. Knowledge had been hoarded, while sons were sacrificed to preserve obedience and control. Forensic teams excavated near the cemetery. They uncovered hundreds of graves, many of infants and young boys with extreme bone deformities. The scale of death was far greater than anyone first imagined. Journalists swarmed, but authorities shielded survivors. Men who had never left the valley were suddenly placed in hospitals, confronted with machines, lights, and strangers. Their shock was overwhelming, their fear almost childlike, yet hope flickered. The 16-year-old who had escaped now stood as proof that resistance existed within the valley. His voice, though frail, revealed the truth that finally forced the world to confront the hidden brotherhood. The Jackson discovery shook not just medicine, but law, religion, and ethics. How could a society have lived hidden so long? How could so many sons suffer unnoticed only miles from modern towns? By the end of 1983, the Jackson Valley stood empty, its cabins abandoned. But its story had just begun, a chilling testimony of isolation, control, and the unimaginable cost of sealing men away for 7 generations. When authorities evacuated the valley, 237 Jackson men were transported to hospitals. For most, it was their first time leaving the mountains. They entered a world beyond comprehension, filled with noise, light, and machines. Doctors examined every survivor. 98% showed genetic conditions linked to consanguineous unions. Sons carried syndromes previously considered rare curiosities. Some displayed combinations so unusual that researchers classified them as entirely new disorders emerging from extreme inbreeding. Medical teams faced overwhelming challenges. Many men required immediate surgeries to correct jaws, spines, or hearts. Others needed lifelong care. Hospitals transformed into places of triage, where brothers and cousins were stabilized one after another. Psychologists noted cognitive collapse in much of the group. Countless men had the minds of children despite adult bodies. Communication was fragmented, relying on gestures developed in the valley, which baffled outsiders attempting conversation. Legal questions complicated matters further. None of the Jackson men possessed documentation. Births, unions, and deaths had never been registered. Governments had to create new identities, estimating ages and assigning legal fathers for the first time. Some elders were charged. Ezekiel Jackson and two close allies faced accusations of abuse and negligence. They had enforced the cycle knowingly, condemning sons to deformity. Yet even they showed cognitive damage from generations of collapse. Authorities debated responsibility. Were elders criminals or victims of their own system? Eventually, courts ruled only those clearly capable of decision-making could be held accountable. Most others were classified as incapable of legal responsibility. Rehabilitation proved agonizing. Older men rarely adapted. Having known nothing but cabins, fields, and brothers, they could not comprehend cities, currency, or modern law. Many spent the rest of their lives in institutions. Younger sons showed more promise. With therapy, some learned to read, speak, and navigate society. Doctors marveled at their resilience, calling it proof of human adaptability even under crushing genetic and cultural isolation. One young Jackson, who had escaped during the storm, became central to integration. He studied, worked, and eventually spoke publicly about his experience. He urged that the suffering of his brothers not be forgotten. Support networks formed. Specialists established the Jackson Foundation, dedicated to caring for survivors and researching their conditions. Genetic samples collected from the men became invaluable to science, helping map mutations rarely visible elsewhere. Public reaction was intense. Newspapers depicted haunting images of blue-skinned men, twisted limbs, and silent faces. Some readers responded with pity, others with horror. The Jackson name became synonymous with hidden cost of inbreeding. As years passed, the valley itself was transformed. Cabins collapsed, fields returned to forest, and graves remained as mute witnesses. A memorial was erected, honoring sons lost to a century of confinement. The Jackson story influenced policy. Governments created monitoring programs to identify isolated male communities at risk of repeating similar patterns. Efforts aimed to balance respect for belief with protection against genetic catastrophe. For survivors, outcomes varied. Some younger men built lives, found work, and joined wider society. Others required lifelong supervision. A number never adjusted, their bodies and minds too marked by the burden of ancestry. Despite tragedy, scientific contribution was profound. Geneticists mapped dozens of rare conditions through Jackson samples. Research produced tools for counseling men considering cousin unions, offering knowledge that might prevent repetition of similar collapse. The aftermath of discovery proved that even the most isolated lineage could shape the world beyond it. The Jackson men, though broken by circumstance, became unwilling teachers to medicine, law, and history. Thus ended the first chapter of life beyond the valley. The Jackson survivors, each marked by visible and invisible scars, carried forward a lesson written in their blood. Isolation breeds collapse, but truth breeds understanding. Decades after the valley's collapse, the story of the Jackson men still echoes through medicine and history. Their lives, though confined and twisted by isolation, reshaped global understanding of genetics, culture, and survival. By the early 2000s, geneticists worldwide studied preserved Jackson samples. Analyses revealed over 40 rare conditions, some known, some previously unseen. The men's DNA mapped the extremes of what occurs when bloodlines are narrowed for 7 generations. Researchers concluded that in some individuals, genetic similarity exceeded 70%. This level of overlap was thought impossible in a viable population, yet the Jacksons had endured long enough to prove otherwise, though at devastating cost. Doctors compared their findings with other isolated groups, mountain sects, island clans, even religious brotherhoods. None showed deterioration as severe. The Jackson case became a benchmark in discussions of consanguinity and human resilience. Public policy shifted as a result. States introduced counseling programs for male cousins considering unions. Warnings about genetic collapse entered discussions in universities, religious institutions, and medical offices, guided by evidence from Jackson survivors. For the men themselves, life paths diverged. Some integrated, working jobs, starting friendships, and building new identities. Others remained in assisted facilities, unable to adapt. All carried visible reminders of the Valley's unyielding code. One survivor, Jacob Jackson, pursued science. Gifted with sharper cognition, he became a geneticist. He told colleagues, "My brothers suffered so we could understand." Each discovery honors those who could not speak for themselves. Conferences echoed his words. He described growing among silent brothers, watching nephews buried, and learning that elders knew more than they admitted. His testimony gave both humanity and urgency to scientific findings. The Jackson Foundation expanded into a global center for rare genetic disease research. Laboratories stored DNA from surviving brothers, using it to decode disorders and pioneer treatments. The legacy of suffering became a tool for healing. Meanwhile, the valley itself returned to wilderness. Trees grew over cabins, fields vanished beneath brush, and wildlife reclaimed streams. Yet a memorial stone stood, carved with the message, "In memory of the sons bound by blood." Each year, scholars, doctors, and descendants visited. Some laid flowers. Others placed journals, photographs, or research notes. The site became both graveyard and classroom, reminding visitors of the fragile balance between tradition and survival. Survivors who adapted often spoke publicly. They told audiences about isolation, about believing outsiders were corrupt, about watching brothers weakened by laws they were forbidden to question. Their honesty pierced silence that once smothered truth. The Jackson name became symbolic. To some, it represented tragedy. To others, it represented discovery. Above all, it warned how obedience to one man's decree can trap generations in a cycle of unavoidable suffering. In time, films, books, and documentaries retold their story. Always, the focus remained the same: a valley of men who lived apart, obeyed without doubt, and paid the price with body and mind. By 2015, new sequencing technologies revealed even greater detail. Scientists mapped step by step how each generation's genome deteriorated. The Jackson men gave the world the clearest evidence of what unchecked isolation does to human life. Jacob Jackson summarized their legacy best. "Our blood carried silence, deformity, and loss, but it also carried lessons. If the world listens, our suffering prevents others from repeating our mistakes." His words endured. Thus, the Jackson line, though broken, achieved a strange immortality. Their bodies shaped science. Their voices shaped law. Their memory shaped cautionary tales told wherever men gathered to discuss faith, blood, and survival. The legacy of the Jackson men proves one truth above all: diversity sustains strength. When blood narrows, collapse follows, and when silence reigns, suffering multiplies. Their story stands eternal, carved into the history of mankind. In the end, such stories remind us that when families cross the natural limits of relationships, it leads only to pain, suffering, and broken generations. Every human being is honored with dignity, and protecting that dignity means respecting the boundaries set for us. From this we learn: when we protect family ties in the right way, society stays healthy, pure, and strong. Let us take this as a reminder, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to walk with wisdom and care for the future.